I'm Karima Brown. It's Sunday night and it's time for The Fix.
Tourism is vital to the South African economy. The sector alone contributed 2.9% to our GDP in 2016, but it's also beset with many challenges, including state capture. Tonight we unpack its role in the investment drive of President Ramaphosa as we count down to the all-important investment summit with Tourism Minister Derek Hanekop. Then we take a broader look at the progress made toward the investment summit, which is hoped to engage all sectors in how to kickstart an economy in recession and stagnant growth with our expert panel of business leaders and economists. The Fix starts now.
This is The Fix, where every Sunday night, without fear of favour, we ask the newsmakers the big questions. We look ahead and tell you what matters, how it affects you, and why you should care. And with me, as usual, my sparring partner, Sunday Times and Business Day columnist, Peter Bruce. Hi, Peter.
Karima, hi. Yeah.
Hi. Your company's had a very busy day today.
It's had a very busy day. They published an apology for and a retraction of three very big stories that they've broken over the past decade.
Yes.
Involving one Sars, the rendition of Zimbabweans illegally, and the Cato Manor so-called death squads, all of which did both the country and the newspaper itself a great deal of damage. And I think we want to take our hats off to Bongwani Sikoko, who's the editor. Wasn't there at the time, but he's taken responsibility. And you know, I don't know what more you get to do as the editor. You can't make it go away. You know, these things happened.
But of course, Thandi from the Media Monitoring Unit, Thandi Smith, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us on The Fix. There's a lot of lessons for us to learn. Let's start with whether this apology actually cuts it. Does it tell us what really happened, and is it holding people accountable?
I think it's definitely a step in the right direction. I don't think it cuts it by any means. I think that there's still a long way to go to rectifying damage. I mean, I don't even know if it's damage that can be rectified. You know, people were really badly affected. Jobs were lost, lives were affected. And you know, there is a long way to go, but it's definitely a step in the right direction. It shows, you know, the accountability is happening, that there are processes taking place.
Now, Peter,
I think as Thandi was saying, you know, I mean, what would suffice? I mean, it's impossible for the Sunday Times to give, say, Pete Richer his job back at SARS. What is possible is for SARS to give Pete Richer his job back, and for the Hawks to give Anwar Dramat his job back. We keep saying all these skills that we've lost. Yeah. Well, we know about 6 or 7 people out there who we could get back into the system if they wanted to come back. You know, one doesn't know what their circumstances are now. Yeah. But it's not, you know, the Sunday Times can't do that for anybody. I mean, it's up to the state.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a particular role, though, for newspapers to play. We're in a very politically loaded environment, Thandi, as the country goes forward, to actually try and connect the dots. We've got several commissions of inquiry, we've got police investigations, and newspapers are obviously going to be played by sources. So there's already confusion, for example, on whether the journalists who were part of writing the story are actually fired from the Sunday Times or whether they've left the Sunday Times, because we've got 2 different versions. How should they be dealing with this matter, and should only Mzilikazi wa Afrika and Stephen Hofstadter be held accountable? Because Felicia Opald, for example, didn't even edit the Sunday Times when the Cato Manor death squad story was run. It was Ray Hartley.
I mean, as Peter was saying, these stories are stories that have taken place over the last almost decade, and you know, there's no way that you're going to manage to hold every single person that was involved at every single step along the way. But I think, as I was saying before, it's definitely a start, but it's not the entirety of the process. And like you were saying, you know, if there were resignations or if they were fired, it's a very different outcome. And I think given the public interest and the prominence of these stories, especially with the SARS rogue units, I think that there is a public interest to know what those processes are, and you know, for the public to be kept in the loop around what's going on. So I think that there is a lot more information that we can get about what's happening.
There were suggestions that the Sunday Times actually goes to the Nugent and the Zondo commissions. Is that the best way to get information out of journalists about sources, particularly in a country where there's always been this push for the media tribunal and we're having to really protect our turf in terms of freedom of the press?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it doesn't even stop there. Media are having to protect their entire credibility, working really hard to maintain the trust with their audiences, the trust with the industry generally. So it is a really rocky time for media and politics at the moment. And I think a lot of journalists, a lot of media houses are on very thin ice when it comes to their own credibility and safeguarding, the further entrenched regulation. And that's the last thing we want. But is going into the inquiries the right step? I'm not sure if that will really solve the problem. Media have to be better at being more accountable and more transparent around processes and how they operate, especially with a publication like the Sunday Times that has as much power as it does in the industry and with its audiences. Trust is really easy to lose, but it's really difficult to build back. But also to say, media don't always get it right. The Sunday Times isn't the only example of how media, can get it wrong. And the important part is to see the people involved be held accountable, to use our mechanisms available to us, our complaints mechanisms, and things like the press council and such. But it's a very grey area. I don't think there's one right answer.
Peter, you've edited many newspapers.
Yeah.
If you were the editor of the Sunday Times, how would you go about restoring its reputation?
Well, I would just make sure that, basically this is about how you structure your flow of news. Any news story that went into the Sunday Times, whether it was a wrong one like these were or a right one, goes through a lot of hands. And you just need to make sure that the people who are dealing with it as it goes through the process are all professional, all able to put their hand up and say, I'm uncomfortable with this, I don't like this. And use the editor to then decide what to publish and what not to publish. I grew up reading the Sunday Times. I've been reading the Sunday Times for, I think, 55 years. And when I was younger, it was a newspaper that took me to the sort of inside story. And that's changed over the last couple of years. And I think that what Bongani Sitoko has got to try and do is get back to that. It's not a scoop chaser. You want to basically explain to the country what is happening to it.
Yes. And
that's much more interesting journalism than hoo-ha, big scoop, one-word headline kind of a thing. And I think, that started, in the 2000s, early on. And it's changed the nature of the paper. And I think if I was the editor of the Sunday Times, I would go back to its roots and say, what was it about it that worked? Because we're the same country in many ways, although our politics are different now. But we're the same conservative audience that it always was. And that's what he's got to look for. He's got to go back to the Sunday Times roots, and he'll find real journalism there again, and that will be his and the paper's salvation.
Thandi, your final word. How does the Sunday Times regain its credibility? Many people say that this apology was only brought because Peter O'Sullivan threatened a boycott on the paper. Paul O'Sullivan threatened a boycott on the paper. How do they go back? And more importantly, how do we cross-check information? Because people look at the news, and of course the worst thing you can have in a country is when people are unable to distinguish between a fact and a lie.
I think, just what you're saying is such a critical thing to think about. We're in an environment where we're dealing with massive amounts of misinformation, of dodgy news sites, which doesn't only impact, the media themselves, but it impacts the entire industry. And audiences have to become far more aware around discerning between, credible versus not credible media. And so the Sunday Times has an especially hard task ahead of itself. But like I said, it's the start of the process. It's the correct approach to take. And be transparent. Let us know what's going on. Be consistent with keeping up this approach to dealing with the problems, and report on good quality investigative journalism. It's what we need.
Absolutely, and of course be transparent as we demand from politicians and every other elite in the country. We have power. We're not called the Fourth Estate for nothing. Thandi Smith, thank you so very much for joining us on this part of our discussion. Now, of course, Peter, the other big story in the news this week is the VBS scandal, and this story is just growing legs and legs and legs.
I was determined, as I was saying in my column this morning, that I was determined not to make any judgments. It's really hard not to make any judgments. But the Sunday Times lead is an excellent one. They seem to have discovered that Jacob Zuma, who you remember got a 7.8 million rand loan from VBS to pay back what, remember Pravin Gordhan decided that this was the amount of money that he owed. And it appears that he hasn't been servicing this loan. So he's got the money. He may not have got the money. It was reported that he had the money by the bank. He hasn't serviced it yet.
And the other, of course, other party that's affected by this is, of course, the economic freedom fighters and Floyd Shivambu at the heart of the crisis that's enveloped him, particularly around his brother. Let's take a listen to his response to the allegations so far.
I have not received any money from any VBS account, and that is what I emphasize in the statement that I issued. And I want to give you some context that this information that we are responding to, the source is a person who claims to have spoken to the Reserve Bank. I spoke this morning with the governor of the South African Reserve Bank to check if any of the Reserve Bank deputy governors or himself have given information to Daily Maverick. And then he sent a clear text message, which is going to now confirm with a letter to say that none of the HODs and none of the deputy governors in the Reserve Bank has ever given information to the effect that I have received 10 million. So that thing is fake news.
That's, of course, Floyd Shivambu. Peter, do you believe him?
Well, it's not a question of whether I believe him, man. I'm going to believe investigators when they tell me what the truth, and I believe what the courts tell me eventually. It looks as if the EFF is going to double down on this thing, and they're not going to give an inch. They're going to fight back. And one can only hope for Floyd Shivambu's sake that that he's telling the truth, and that when investigators do a lifestyle audit, and when they do go follow the money, it's not going to be very difficult to follow. From what we see. The only thing that I worry about these reports is that once again, as KPMG did to Sars and all these other investigations during the Zuma era, we appear to have now gone and investigated a bank and not given the accused, as it were, an opportunity to have their say. And what Thuli Madonsela did so well as public protector, she'd do her report, and then she'd give it to everybody who was named in it, give them a week to comment on it, and then finish it. And that's what I think that we should be doing.
There is also, of course, the fact that the NPA ignored the claim from the South African Reserve Bank that there's a problem at VBS. And, of course, they took their time in investigating the matter. And we saw that horrific...
Well, not only that, but they then accused the Reserve Bank of dangerous behavior by appointing worksmen to do an investigation.
And then, of course, there was this massive plea by all sectors, including the African National Congress in that province, because they heavily implicated, to the ANC top six to try and intervene to save this supposedly black bank.
Look, the Limpopo ANC is in deep trouble, and it might actually work to Cyril Ramaphosa's benefit.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I think what is going to be interesting is, of course, Julius Malema's press conference, but we'll talk about that a little later on. I bet it's going to be one massive deflection, but we wait to see. After the break, we speak to our first guest this evening, Tourism Minister Derek Hanekom, to find out what role tourism sector is playing in the President investment drive. Stay tuned. Don't go anywhere.